خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين عليه الصلاة والسلام يتمنى هذه المنزلة. فعوا واعقلوا، ما هي هذه المنزلة التي يتمناها خير البرية عليه الصلاة والسلام؟ يتمنى أن يكون شهيدا، والذي نفس محمد بيده لوددت أن أغزو فأقتل ثم أغزو فأقتل ثم أغزو فأقتل. فهذه الحياة الطويلة العريضة يختصرها الذي يوحى إليه من رب السماوات والأرض سبحانه وتعالى. هذا النبي الكريم الذي يوحى إليه يختصر هذه الحياة بهذه الكلمات، يتمنى هذه المنزلة. فالسعيد.
A decade of conflict in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 gave Islamist extremists a rallying point and training field. The communist government in Afghanistan gained control in 1978, but was unable to establish enduring control. At the end of 1979, the Soviet government sent in military units to ensure that the country would remain securely under Moscow's influence. The response was an Afghan national resistance movement that defeated Soviet forces. Young Muslims from around the world flocked to Afghanistan to join as volunteers in what was seen as a holy war, jihad, against an invader. The largest numbers came from the Middle East. Some were Saudis, and among them was Osama Bin Laden. 23 when he arrived in Afghanistan in 1980. Bin Laden was the 17th of 57 children of a Saudi construction magnate. 6'5" and thin, Bin Laden appeared to be ungainly, but was in fact quite athletic, skilled as a horseman, runner, climber, and soccer player. He had attended Abdul Aziz University in Saudi Arabia. By some accounts, he had been interested there in religious studies, inspired by tape recordings of fiery sermons by Abdullah Azam, a Palestinian and a disciple of Sayyid Qutb. Bin Laden was conspicuous among the volunteers not because he showed evidence of religious learning, but because he had access to some of the family's huge fortune. Though he took part in at least one actual battle, he became known chiefly as a person who generously helped fund the anti-Soviet jihad. Bin Laden understood better than most of the volunteers the extent to which the continuation and eventual success of the jihad in Afghanistan depended on an increasingly complex, almost worldwide organization. This organization included a financial support network that came to be known as the Golden Chain, put together mainly by financiers in Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf states. Donations flowed through charities or other non-governmental organizations known as NGOs. Bin Laden and the Afghan-Arabs drew largely on funds raised by this network, whose agents roamed world markets to buy arms and supplies for the mujahadeen. Mosques, schools, and boarding houses served as recruiting stations in many parts of the world, including the United States. Some were set up as an Islamic extremists or their financial backers. Bin Laden had an important part in this activity. He and the cleric Azam had joined in creating a bureau of services called the Maktab al-Khidmat, which channeled recruits into Afghanistan. The international environment for Bin Laden's efforts was ideal. Saudi Arabia and the United States supplied billions of dollars worth of secret assistance to rebel groups in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet occupation. This assistance was funneled through Pakistan. The Pakistan Military Intelligence Service, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISI, helped train the rebels and distribute the arms. But Bin Laden and his comrades had their own source of support and training, and they received little or no assistance from the United States. April 1988 brought victory for the Afghan jihad. Moscow declared it would pull out its military forces of Afghanistan within the next 9 months. As the Soviets began their withdrawal, the jihadi leaders debated what to do next. Bin Laden and Azam agreed that the organization successfully created for Afghanistan should not be allowed to dissolve. They established what they called a base, or a foundation, as a potential general headquarters for future jihad. Though Azam had been considered number one in the Maktab al-Khidmat, by August 1988, bin Laden was clearly the emir of Al Qaeda. This organization structure included as its operating arms an intelligence component, a military committee, a financial committee, a political committee, and a committee in charge of media affairs and propaganda. It also had an advisory council, Shura, made up of bin Laden's inner circle. Bin Laden's assumption of the helm of Al Qaeda was evidence of the growing self-confidence and ambition. He soon made clear his desire for unchallenged control and for preparing the mujahadeen to fight anywhere in the world. Azam, by contrast, favored continuing to fight in Afghanistan until it had a true Islamist government. And, as a Palestinian, he saw Israel as the top priority for the next stage. Whether the dispute was about power, personal differences, or strategy, it ended on November 24th, 1989, when a remotely controlled car bomb killed Abdul Azam and both of his sons. The killers were assumed to be rival Egyptians. The outcome left bin Laden indisputably in charge of what remained of the Maktab al-Khidmat and Al Qaeda. Through writers like Sayyid Qutb in the presence of Egyptian Islamist teachers in the Saudi educational system, Islamists already had a strong intellectual influence on bin Laden and his Al Qaeda colleagues. By the late 1980s, the Egyptian Islamic movement, badly battered in the government crackdown following President Anwar Sadat's assassination, was centered in two major organizations, the Islamic Group and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a spiritual guide for both, but especially the Islamic Group was the so-called blind sheikh, Omar Abdul Rahman. The group was also called Gamma Islamiyah. His preaching had inspired the assassination of Sadat. After being in and out of Egyptian prisons during the 1980s, Abdul Rahman found refuge in the United States. From his headquarters in Jersey City, he distributed messages calling for the murder of unbelievers. The most important Egyptian in bin Laden's circle was a surgeon, Dr. Ayman a-Zawahiri, who had a strong faction in the Egyptian Islamic Jihad movement. Many of the followers became important members in the new organization, and his own close ties with bin Laden led many to think of him as the deputy head of Al Qaeda. He would, in fact, become bin Laden's deputy some years later when they merged their organizations. By the fall of 1989, bin Laden had sufficient stature among Islamic extremists that a Sudanese political leader, Hassan al-Turabi, urged him to transplant his whole organization to Sudan. Turabi headed the National Islamic Front in a coalition that had recently seized power in Khartoum. Bin Laden agreed to help Turabi in an ongoing war against African Christian separatists in southern Sudan, and also to do some road building. Turabi, in return, would let bin Laden use Sudan as a base for worldwide business operations and for preparations for jihad. While agents of bin Laden began to buy property in Sudan in 1990, bin Laden himself moved from Afghanistan back to Saudi Arabia. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Bin Laden, whose efforts in Afghanistan had earned him celebrity and respect, proposed to the Saudi monarchy that he summon mujahadeen for a jihad to retake Kuwait. He was rebuffed, and the Saudis joined the United States-led coalition. After the Saudis agreed to allow the United States Armed Forces to be based in the kingdom, bin Laden and a number of Islamic clerics began to publicly denounce the arrangement. The Saudi government exiled the clerics and undertook to silence bin Laden by, among other things, taking away his passport. With help from a dissident member of the royal family, he managed to get out of the country under the pretext of attending an Islamic gathering in Pakistan in April of '91. By 1994, the Saudi government would freeze bin Laden's financial assets and revoke his citizenship. He no longer had a country he could call his own. Bin Laden moved to the Sudan in 1991 and set up a large and complex set of intertwined businesses and terrorist enterprises. In time, the former would encompass numerous companies and a global network of bank accounts and non-governmental institutions. Fulfilling his bargain with Turabi, bin Laden used his construction company to build a new highway from Khartoum to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda finance officers and top operatives used their positions in bin Laden's businesses to acquire weapons, explosives, and technical equipment for terrorist purposes. One founding member, Abu Hajir al-Iraqi, used his position as head of a bin Laden investment company to carry out procurement trips from Western Europe to the Far East. Two others, Wadi al-Hajj and Mubarak Duri, who had become acquainted in Tucson, Arizona in the late 1980s, went as far afield as China, Malaysia, the Philippines, and the former Soviet states of Ukraine and Belarus. Bin Laden's impressive array of offices covertly provided financial and other support for terrorist activities. The network included a major business enterprise in Cyprus, a services branch in Zagreb, an office of the Benevolence International Foundation in Sarajevo, which supported the Bosnian Muslims in their conflict with Serbia and Croatia, and a non-governmental organization in Baku, Azerbaijan, that was employed as well by the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, both as a source and conduit for finances and as a support center for the Muslim rebels in Chechnya. He also made use of the already established Third World Relief Agency, headquartered in Vienna, whose branch office locations included Zagreb and Budapest. Bin Laden later set up a non-government organization in Nairobi as a cover for operations there. Bin Laden now had a vision of himself as a head of an international jihad confederation. In Sudan, he established an Islamic Army Shura that was to serve as the coordinating body for the consortium of terrorist groups with which he was forging alliances. It was composed of his own Al-Qaeda Shura together with leaders or representatives of terrorist organizations that were still independent. In building this Islamic army, he enlisted groups from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Oman, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Somalia, and Eritrea. Al-Qaeda also established cooperative but less formal relationships with other extremist groups from these same countries, from the African states of Chad, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Uganda, and from the Southeastern Asian states of Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Bin Laden maintained connections in the Bosnian conflict as well. The groundwork for a true global terrorist network was being laid. Bin Laden also provided equipment and training assistance to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines, and also to a newly forming Philippine group that called itself the Abu Sayyaf, after one of the major Afghan jihadist commanders. Al-Qaeda helped Jemaah Islamiyah, a nascent organization headed by Indonesian Islamists with cells scattered across Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. It also aided a Pakistani group engaged in insurrection talks in Kashmir. In mid-1991, Bin Laden dispatched a band of supporters to the northern Afghanistan border to assist the Tajikistan Islamists in the ethnic conflicts that had been boiling there ever before the Central Asian departments of the Soviet Union became independent states. The pattern of expansionism through building alliances extended even inside the United States. A Muslim organization called Al-Qifa had numerous branch offices, the largest of which was in the Al-Faruq Mosque in Brooklyn. In the mid-1980s, it had been set up as one of the first outposts of Abdul and Osama Bin Laden's Maktab al-Khidmat. Other cities with branches of the Al-Qifa included Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Tucson. Al-Qifa recruited American Muslims to fight in Afghanistan. Some of them would participate in terrorist actions in the United States in the early 1990s and in an Al-Qaeda operations elsewhere, including the 1998 attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and later, the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks.